Hi, Rebecca. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm just realizing my lighting is terrible, so I'll just stay off video. Can you hear me?
We can. Yep.
Okay, I'll just plan to stay off video for the most part tonight. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, Grant, I don't know if you're online. Oh, there we go. There is Joy.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so it is 5 o'clock and we have Joy online here. So this is going to be an overview of our Kafir/audit. This is required annually by the charter. It is a function of the assembly that is generally mostly handled by staff, but then the auditors also meet with myself or the mayor at the time to ensure that everything is going well. As far as I know, it has and did. There were a little bit of complications just due to the complexity of the systems we had this year, but I will let Joy go over all of those. And Joy, we did just get all 3 of our books. So if you're going to be referring to them, we do have those in front of us today, except for Assembly Member Rebecca Himshoot, who is traveling today, so does not have the book in front of her. But thank you very much for joining us from Zoom, and the floor is yours, please.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And what I really, first off, I'm Joy Mariner. For those of you I've not had the pleasure to meet, I'm an audit partner and office managing partner of the BDO Anchorage office. And I've been with our office for, goodness, now a little over 18 years, going on 19 years. And working with the city and borough of Sitka, for probably the last 5 years or so. Our firm for longer, but myself for the last 5 years or so. And so, what I'd really like this to be is a real work session. So as you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me. I am used to the online meeting thing now, where I don't mind if you'd like to just butt in. I can't really necessarily read your faces as well to know that you're wanting to ask a question. So feel free to just jump right in and ask those questions. And as was mentioned, really the goal here is for you to feel comfortable with a high level overview of the financial statements and the audit process, because I work for you as the assembly. And I really, as a public accountant, my job really is to make sure that the users of the financial statements aren't going to make wrong decisions. And that's you as the assembly. It includes your bondholders. It includes the people of the city and borough of Sitka, making sure that the books and records are accurately presented and the information is fairly presented and accurate. And so, really when we come in and look at the audit, we're really doing several different audits, 5 audits, sort of. We audit your financial statements. We also audit your federal grant compliance, your state grant compliance. We also do an audit of your PFC program and the airport passenger facility charges and making sure that you're compliant with PFC. And then your audit is also performed in accordance with government auditing standards because you have a single audit. So your poor team gets hit by a lot of different things, a lot of requests from us. And we do start the audit back really, right in July, right after fiscal year end, with our audit requests and some planning conversations. And one thing I will say about your team is that they do an excellent job of speaking with me throughout the year when they have a technical question or if there's an unusual thing happening. And my goodness, what an unusual year for you and for the world. Before COVID happened, you already had an unusual year because of the sale of the hospital and the hospital assets and the component unit going away. And so that's in the financial statements. We'll touch on a few highlights with that. But then you also have COVID-19 and the pandemic and the spending on the monies there. And, to tell you honestly, it was an unusual year for a lot of people in terms of the way things changed, because a lot of your controls or the way that you did things, you used to do it all one way. And with the pandemic and the shutdowns, there were certain things that had to change very quickly. So that was quite a lot of work for your team. And then just during the audit, they were also trying to get out all of the funding. We did not actually audit your CARES money because the majority of almost all of your CARES money was spent in fiscal year 2021, so after June 30th. And so we didn't audit the spending of the CARES money yet. That will be done with the 2021 audit. But your team was working on the audit at the same time they were getting grants out, and they were spending down that CARES Act money and following your guidelines in terms of how that money should be spent. And frankly, that, as you know, that they were changing the rules, or clarifying, I think I should say, clarifying the rules all the way up until about a week before the deadline to spend the money, and then they extended it. So, we did our best to try to advise your team along the way, and they did an excellent job of documenting, from what I can tell. But we'll know for sure next year when we audit it. But I got a copy of the grant applications, and I did a lot of just advanced preparation for the 2021 audit, and just paying attention to how that might fall out. And I was impressed with the grant applications and the policies you had in place, and all the things that you had to make sure that the audit goes well for 2021. So that's most of what I'll say about CARES and COVID. But you should have 3 packages. I'm sorry for the killing of trees, I really am. And if you would like me to, I can share my screen and walk through the highlights of what I want to cover. Is that the easiest, or would you like me to reference page numbers?
I would appreciate a shared screen. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully I can do that. I'm going to try. Is that sharing the right screen? Can you see the federal and state single audit reports?
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Give me just a second. Always makes my actual Teams window look really small when I share my screen. So and maybe I'll just move you over here so we can see a little bit better. So there are 3 packages. The first one you should have is your actual comprehensive annual financial report. And this one is 150 pages. I promise I won't go through them all. But we are going to touch on some pretty key highlights that the assembly, you all need to be paying attention to from a year-to-year basis, and covering a few areas that you may want to go back and refer to, or read on your own. And we'll cover just a few key highlights in here. The next item is the audit wrap-up. This is where we'll spend the first part of our time. And then there's a federal and state single audit report, which is the compliance reporting associated with the city and borough. I did not include, I don't know if you even have it, the PFC audit, which is the airport passenger facility charges, but we had no findings on that. So there's my report on the PFC audit. Went really well. So let's look first at the audit wrap-up. And this is our auditor's required communication to you as the assembly. So I'll try to keep this colorful and interesting, and I apologize I can't be there with you today. I've had my first vaccine, but I'm not quite there on my second vaccine, so I'm close. But as it turns out, we actually did come in person to Sitka for your audit. I don't know if you're aware of that. You're one of the only communities that we did go to. Our whole team went and got tested and quarantined. And we were able to do kind of a group of cities all together where we traveled, and there were a lot of efficiencies there. But also, frankly, by October, we were all ready to get out of our own homes. And so I was thankful to be able to come. We did still practice social distancing and make sure that we gave your staff the space, but we were on site in October, and that on-site field work was lessened to 1 week. We're usually there for 2 or 1 week of interim and 1 week of final, but we tried to kind of compress all the testing into 1 week. So it was a long week, but it went really well. And let's go through a couple of key highlights from this report. So if you turn with me to the status of the audit on page 3, a couple key things, and I'll try to zoom in where it makes sense to help you. And the third bullet point here is that we issued an unmodified opinion on the statements, and that's a clean opinion. It's unmodified, meaning there are no modifications we deemed necessary to the financial statements in order to form an opinion on them. And we also issued an unmodified opinion on compliance for your federal and state programs that were audited, as well as an unmodified opinion on your PFC audit. So this is, if you hear nothing else, these are the 3 bullet points that are really important that your granting agencies will look at, that your bondholders would want to see, the unmodified opinion, and no findings reported. Your team's cooperation, that's the last bullet point. Excellent, as usual. They had turnover this year. There's a changeover from Jay's eventual soon retirement to Melissa, and there's a lot of change just with COVID. Honestly, with all of the changes going on with CARES money, not everybody was able to get through that volume as quickly and as successfully as your team. So excellent work on your management side, and full cooperation from an audit perspective. So the next page, on page 4, a couple of key things to note really is that you didn't adopt any huge significant accounting policies this year, no major changes. In fact, some of the accounting standards were deferred because of COVID. They said, okay, we're not going to make you adopt this now. We're going to wait a year and give you an extra year to do it. So most of the pronouncements that were supposed to have been implemented were not adopted in 2020. They'll be adopted in 2021. There was one change for, I won't go through the details, but GASB 89, which is kind of interest costs on construction. Not a significant change from my perspective to you. Now, coming up in 2021, we'll look at that, but 2021, there's some changes that will affect the borough on the accounting side. Nothing really, I think, that the assembly needs to be too concerned about, but we'll mention that in a moment. In a few moments. It's actually in the financial statements. So then when we look at your statements, some of the numbers in your statements are not hard and fast numbers. They're estimated. And that's normal. Not everybody can say with huge determination what your total pension liability will be over the next 40 years, right? You don't exactly know how much it will cost to close your landfill when it is finally full. And you don't fully know how much of your receivables will be collected versus having to get written off. And so, or sent to collections. And so those are your 3 main estimates in the statements. None of these are estimates that I think management has any incentive to manipulate, or none of them are very complex in terms of their, the way that they're calculated. For the landfill, your engineering group puts together, and solid waste kind of puts together a plan on that. You have a report that you rely on. You know how much you filled. The net pension liability and the OPEB liabilities are determined by the state of Alaska, and you don't have any say really in what that liability should or should not be. We do review that pension liability report to make sure it's reasonable, that they're using correct actuarial estimates, but you can't pay off that liability even if you wanted to, because the way the multi-plan works, multi-employer pension plan works, is that you really can't advance pay into that system without giving that benefit away to the other communities as well. So these are the main kind of numbers, just so you know, in the statements, that we audit them to make sure the estimates are reasonable, but they are estimates. And then there weren't any kind of major concerns with the way those estimates were developed, just so you know. The next page, corrected and uncorrected misstatements. We did assist with recording a few entries, none of which we consider to be material. We do assist every year with helping on the pension adjustments. They're quite complex. GASB 68 and 75 cover recording of pension liabilities and OPEB liabilities. And when we look at the statements, I promise not to go through the 15 pages of pension notes. But we assist your team in doing that, as we do for all of our governmental clients statewide. And then there was one allowance for the harbor receivables that was booked by your team after we began the audit. Again, not an error. They were still looking at the receivables at the harbor, but that estimate of how much would be collected was adjusted at the end of the year. No uncorrected misstatements. Those would be things that we found, but were not corrected in the statement, so nothing this year. When we look at the component units, the school district had no audit adjustments and no uncorrected misstatements. There was one hospital adjustment. So the hospital was actually audited as of the closure date. So July 31st, 2019, there was a kind of a 1 month financial statement done for the hospital, and there was an adjustment recorded by that auditor, not BDO. BDO did not do that audit. That was recorded for the pension. Basically, the state employer contributions for PERS were adjusted. And I do have a note there that, as you know, the hospital was sold, and we have a disclosure in the financial statements, or your team put a disclosure in the financial statements to explain what was going on from an accounting perspective for that. Other things just to know, we'll walk through some of the numbers in the statements. Significant unusual transactions, you do have that significant amount of CARES money and the hospital sale, where there are two significant items in 2020. And really no other concerns or risk areas that were unusual in the audit this year. The next page I want to mention is on internal controls. So let's talk briefly about internal controls, because internal controls are very important. And in fact, you as the assembly are the, really the top of the pyramid when we look at internal controls. So internal controls are just the checks and balances that you have in place to make sure that your city and borough is operating correctly and functioning well. But it's not just the things that they do. Those are control activities. It's also the tone at the top and the environment. Do you have an assembly that is paying attention? Do you meet regularly? I know you are, because I read through your assembly meeting minutes when we do your audit. But also, do you identify things that might be risks to your borough? Do you have good information systems, communication between departments, good IT systems that can capture information and accurately report it into the financial statements? So we look at all those aspects of internal control as it relates to the numbers that end up in the financials, and also as it relates to your compliance with grants. Are all those things that are in place enough to make sure you're compliant and that your financial statements are fairly presented? And then we would report to you anything that we think you need to take action on as an assembly. So a significant deficiency or material weakness would be reported in the financials and in the single audit reports. And a deficiency in internal control is things that we find that maybe are minor in nature, or we don't think that they're too big of a deal, but it's something that maybe management should take a look at. Those we communicate verbally. Under the single audit standards, we do not communicate those in writing. And so, really from my perspective, your team does an excellent job of calling me when they're planning to change something. Hey, Joy, we're wanting to do it this way. Is this going to be enough documentation? Do we need to have some sort of signature here? Or is it okay for this person to have access to this system as well as be a check signer? Those are really good questions for them to be asking me, but also for them to be asking each other. Do we have the right plan in place to prevent and detect errors, and also to prevent and detect fraud? And when we talk about fraud, and I don't mean to throw out a scary word, but the audit process is not a fraud audit, but we do have certain procedures that we perform to address the risk of fraud. And fraud occurs with there's a triangle. I don't know if you've ever been through fraud training, but it's opportunity. Do they have the opportunity to commit the fraud? Do they have an attitude, or have they rationalized, yes, there's that I deserve this, or they owe me money, or it's okay, nobody cares. That's the attitude rationalization. And then there's also that kind of need for fraud, somebody who is economically hindered in some way. Maybe they've got some sort of medical issue in their family and they need the money. There's some sort of pressure. Those are the kind of the three things. And what you want to avoid is ever having all three in place, or even two of the three in place at one time, because that's when fraud occurs. And certainly the one that you're most able to prevent is opportunity. Never giving somebody access to cash who is also somebody who has the ability to adjust somebody's customer balance, right? Or having somebody approve a vendor as well as being the person who signs the check in the system. There's lots of checks and balances that you put in place to prevent opportunity. And then the attitude rationalization has a lot to do with the culture of your city and borough. And the pressure is, you know, having good policies in place, having a whistleblower policy in place, making sure that people are being paid competitively and that there's not some sort of incentive for them to commit fraud. So, you know, I just throw that out there as a random addition to this, because I think internal controls, people think, oh, who are the check signers? But it entails a whole lot more than that. And your auditors do have to document our understanding of your controls in all of those different areas. This year, we did not report any internal control deficiencies that we believe you need to take action on. There's a lot of things going on at the city and borough that I think you need to pay attention to. I'm not saying you shouldn't pay attention, but that the systems are currently designed, at least we didn't identify anything that we think you need to take action to change. You do a great job. I know I did look at the assembly minutes for after year end, and just the discussions on CARES and making sure the money was spent the right way. And those are all great discussions to be having. And then your finance and accounting team is pretty good at sort of pushing back at your at the rest of the assembly. I mean, the rest of the borough, to tell them, hey, you know, you can't do that, or I need you to sign this. I need this documentation. So supporting your accounting team on that is pretty important. But really, everybody at the borough is part of making sure that the control systems work. Everybody signs a timesheet. Everybody that spends any money, anybody who works there and has an email address, who's not clicking on a spam email is part of that system. And so, you know, we don't catch everything. Our audit's not an internal control audit, but we do quite a lot in this area. Questions on that before we conclude this part and look at the financial statements? I have a couple other things on here, but questions on internal control? Okay, I'll keep going. So the other required communications are things that we're required to tell you about. We have to tell you if we identified fraud, abuse, violations of laws or regulations, if we had any disagreements or difficulties with management, if they shopped around for another opinion because they disagreed with our conclusion on something. Nothing like that this year. You know, your team really did a great job. Jay set the stage for success. Melissa transitioned in well. It helped that she knew your financial statements really well, and she drafted the financial statements last year. So she has very high level of familiarity with the borough's books and records. So nothing to report on that front. And then the only other thing I'll note to you is that coming up very quickly are some accounting pronouncements. The biggest one that will affect you is leases. That's here, GASB 87. And we talked about this briefly last year, but leases are now going to be tracked differently in the statements. And I know that you already have a team working on putting together a lease schedule and making sure your leases are up to date and that your terms of your leases are negotiated. And, you know, the GASB, which is our accounting standards setter, the Accounting Standards Board, they are now requiring all the leases to go on the books, even if they're operating leases. But we are advising people to only record leases that are significant. You know, if you have $100 lease to, you know, rent some sort of circuit breaker, right? That's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about pole rentals, long-term pole rentals, or property leases, or building leases, or equipment leases, things that may or may not be tracked that way. You're getting the payments, or you're making the payments. And this standard doesn't change anything about the way that your budgeting works or anything about the expenses or the revenues coming in. Rather, it's a comprehensive list of all the leases, and then they go on the books and records as right of use assets and liabilities if you're the leasee. So if you're the person leasing it, you have a right to use that asset. And then if you're leasing to someone else, like a pole rental, then it would be a receivable for the lease, and a liability, a right of use liability. You're allowing them to use that item. So this is a big change, and it will hit this year. And we're already been talking to your team about it, but just be aware of that, that's hitting at the same time, they're also trying to do a lot of CARES compliance documentation. And we don't know yet the full details of what will trickle down from this new assistance package, but we assume it will come down through the local governments to some degree. So there's going to be probably some level of pressure that will come to make sure that money was spent properly as well. That's the only one I wanted to cover here. Any questions on the audit wrap-up before we look at the statements? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. I just want to make sure that you can hear me and I can hear you.
Yep. Yeah, everything's going well. We have someone online as well, so I wanted to give them the opportunity. But yes, please continue.
Okay, great. I'm glad you can hear me okay. So the Kafir, which is your comprehensive annual financial report, I realize there aren't very many people who want to read 150 pages worth of this document. I have read every single page, in case you were worried. And I think it's important that this is a document that is accurate. Some of this is covered by our audit opinion and some of it isn't. But all of it is part of a permanent record of sorts. You're going to keep your financial statements electronically, at least, for a very long time. You know, as long as the city and borough is around, this is part of your permanent record. And it provides a lot more information than just the financial information that we audit. And if you look with me on page, which isn't actually a page, it's the little I page, the table of contents, I'm going to walk you through what's in here, because as an assembly member, you might not realize how much information is put together by your finance department and how you can use it. So the introductory section is your a little bit more about, like, high level about your borough, city and borough. So it has a table of contents, it has a letter of transmittal, a list of your elected officials, and then an organization chart for Sitka overall. And when you look at the letter of transmittal, which is here on page 5, it's actually III, Roman numeral 3. When you look at the transmittal letter, the transmittal letter is actually an excellent overview of Sitka. So if somebody says, maybe you went to some other place and you were talking to somebody else who's an assemblyman or woman on their own assembly, and they ask you about Sitka, you can read just these few pages. It's just 3 or 4 pages long, and it tells you about Sitka, where you are, where you're located, how many people you have, how the election works, what kind of services you provide. It's an excellent overview of the city and borough of Sitka as a whole. And so I'd encourage you to read that, and just, it has some good talking points for you as a assembly person. The next section is the financial section. Yes, please.
This is Valerie. Could I just jump in? I did read the 150 pages, and there is a minor correction on page VII. I was not Vice Deputy Mayor. Kevin Mosier was. And we had Mr. Leach as our municipal administrator. That position was not vacant. Thank you.
And I was elected.
Yeah, Aaron Bean wasn't on there either.
Yeah, so I suggest if you do next year's, there's 2 more new ones. So yeah, you might check the website there.
Okay. Yeah, and I read through those. We don't audit the elected officials page. That's dropped in by your management team, so that might not have been updated. You know, that's something that can be updated still on the official version if you'd like. So we can talk to Melissa about that.
I have to say, I did notice that too.
Okay. So the independent auditor's report is on page 1 to 3. I'm not going to go through that because we already covered the unmodified opinion and the information included in that. And then the management's discussion and analysis is on page 6 through page 17. And the management discussion analysis, if you have ever read any of the financial statements of publicly traded companies or anything like that, the MD&A is like an annual report. It's very similar to an annual report for a publicly traded company, although it has very different information. But it gives you a high-level overview of what happened during the year and comparative information for several years. And I'm not, again, going to go through every page on here, but when you look at the MD&A, you can see there's financial statement highlights. in the MD&A, as well as some other information about your assets and liabilities, what the main impacts were and the changes, what changed during the year. So even, talking about the impact of tourism declines from the coronavirus pandemic and how that impacted your financials. And so this is an excellent read. This is I think it's probably 12 pages long. I'll have to look. Yeah, let's see. 11, 12 pages long. So I think that's something that, when your brain is going at full speed and it's time for bed, this is a good thing to read, just to kind of highlight just a few key sentences, areas that might be of import to your constituents and to you as a member of the assembly. The next section are the basic financial statements, and I will cover a few key highlights on there. And then there's additional required information, which are mostly your pension schedules. There's a lot of detail required now on governmental pensions because so many of the pension systems collapsed. So now there's a lot more information that you have to provide as it relates to pensions. This does come from the state of Alaska, so we audit it only to compare it to what the final released reports are. Then there's also supplementary information, which is combining all of the information that is in the basic financials with more detail. So if you need more detail about your non-major funds, if we'd really quickly want to look at a few of those, but it's page 94, so it's not the easiest to get to. But some of those pages here, you can see there's columns for your different funds. So if you wanted to see, well, how much is the library donation fund have in it this year? What was the activity, the revenues and the expenses? What did we spend in, some of the LIDs or in raw water sales? You can see those funds actually broken out. So it's not necessarily something that we opine on separately, but as a roll-up, that information is available to you and available in the public record so that you can always refer back to it. And then the last section in the Kafir is the statistical section. And the statistical section is maybe the most interesting for many of you. Again, we audited only to compare the information from the financial statements to the statistics because you're paying us to audit the financial information. So that's what we're doing. But there's a lot of other information in here, like your principal property tax payers or your property tax rates, assessed value, a lot of the comparative information. And when you look at these are actually mostly on a 10-year comparative or at least a 5-year comparative. So if you wanted to, for example, look at fund balance in the general fund over the last 10 years, you can turn back to these statistic pages and see a lot of information. So a lot of assembly people like to spend a lot of time in these back schedules because they want to see, okay, when we look at public safety for the last 10 years, what does our spending on public safety look like? Or what's our expenses? These are changes in net positions. So what are expenses for, the electric utility over time? And so it does give you very good trend information and a good way to kind of see what's going on overall over a period of time at the city and borough. Also, as I mentioned, it has property tax information, total estimated actual value, principal property tax payers. This is your mill rate. You've got your tax revenues by sources. Kind of interesting to break out of property tax, sales tax, bed tax. It'll really look different in 2021. And then your principal property tax payers. So that's a really good kind of overview page to be be spending some time in the statistics as an assembly person, because I do think that's going to be a very helpful tool for you. So questions on the overview before we look at the financials as a whole? We are going to cover a couple key sections next. Okay, I'm going to move along to page 20, and I'm going to do my best to zoom in on the screen so you can see, but if you're on your paper copy or on the electronic version you should have received, it's on page 20 that I'm going to start. And page 20 is your statement of net position. So this is for the entire city and borough of Sitka. It includes your school district. You'll note there's no hospital column because the hospital went away in July of 2019. And it has governmental activities and business type activities. So the governmental activities, general fund, has property tax, sales tax. Business type activities are your, your enterprise funds, which in your case are electric, solid waste, wastewater, harbors, all of those are rolling into there. So I'm going back to page 20. So when you look at your assets, your total assets and in the whole of the city and borough of Sitka are just under $600 million, $589 million. You also have some deferred outflows, which are mostly related to your pensions, which are similar to assets. So in total, between all of that, just under $600 million of total assets and deferred outflows. And when you look at those assets, most of your assets are held up in capital assets. Those are, buildings and roads and bridges and electric systems and water systems, wastewater systems, your landfill, all of that kind of stuff is all included in these capital assets. And that's 446 million of that total 597. You also have a significant amount of notes receivable. And then obviously the remainder of the large items have to do with your cash and investments and central treasury items. Some of those cash and investments are restricted for bond covenant accounts or for other purposes. Some of it is not restricted necessarily, but are specifically allocated for certain purposes. So we'll look at that briefly in a moment, but that's your total assets. And then when you look at your total liabilities, these are things that you owe to others. Your total liabilities at the end of the year were $229 million. You also have other certain deferrals. So total deferred inflows of resources of 13 million, but most of your liabilities are in your bonds, notes, and long-term debt. You also have about $38 million in your pension liability and your OPEB liability with the state of Alaska. At the school district, that number includes TERS, it's about 15 million. And then when you look at your net position, I actually think it's really important for us to look at a fund level. So we're going to do that in a moment. But you do see there that the permanent fund has an expendable and a non-expendable portion that is restricted, as well as certain items that are restricted for debt service purposes. When we go back to the next page I want to cover is actually here on page 24, because page 24 gives you a little bit more information on your governmental funds. And if you look towards the bottom, the fund balance in these funds. So in the general fund, you have non-spendable fund balance of 4 million. And that's because the general fund has advanced money to other funds. And you can't spend it in the general fund if you've already advanced it to another fund. There's 9.5 million of committed fund balance that's committed for certain specific purposes. And we can look at that note in a moment. And then 3.8 million of unassigned fund balance in the general fund. And that money is used for working capital. It covers the timing of when you receive money from your taxes and from your granting agencies to when you have to pay it out. That's a really important number to be monitoring. And I know that's something that Melissa looks pretty carefully at pretty regularly with you. The other funds include the permanent fund that are major and the hospital dedicated fund. And the hospital dedicated fund is new this year. At the end of June, you did have that big notes receivable that was still outstanding with with Search. And then ultimately it has a deficit in that fund, of about $2.5 million. When we look at the ins and outs for the year, the general fund total revenues of $28 million this year. Permanent fund is mostly investment income. And then the hospital sale there, you can see the total revenue, and that's the current year payment on the hospital that Search made. That's as well as the tobacco taxes that are being allocated to that fund. And then overall on the general fund side, you have about $24.5 million of expenditures. One thing to note, and I mentioned it before, but your total fund balance in the general fund that's unassigned is about 3.8 million. and you have total expenditures in that fund about 24.5 million. So, you know, I will say that's something to really monitor and make sure you feel comfortable that you have enough a fund balance available to cover your working capital and to cover your expenses. And then, you know, overall, when we look at the funds at the fund level, including the sale of the hospital, total change in fund balance of about 413,000 to the positive in the current year. The CARES Act fund is, I mentioned it briefly, and I'll show you, but it is considered a non-major governmental fund this year. It didn't meet the threshold to be major, but the majority of the CARES Act money was spent in 2021. And so actually all of your CARES Act money was spent in 21 with very, very limited exceptions. And so that money then will show up as its own column in 2021 because of just the sheer level and the volume of spending. Just a couple more statements to cover. I'm sure you're tired of looking at accounting information. This is your enterprise fund assets. We've covered this very briefly, but if you want to see a breakout of what's being carried in each of the funds, you can do that on page, see, this is page 28 and 29. But if you look really quickly at page 30, I think page 30 is worth looking at together because this shows you the income or loss from your enterprise fund activity during the year. And your, you know, overall, there's a couple of things to consider. Your operating loss or income is important, but you really want to look at this income before contributions and transfers number. I think that's a really important number to look at because that's after you've paid your interest cost. And, you know, your overall there, the electric fund is still running at a loss, $2.5 million in 2020. The other funds, it depends on the fund. You've got solid waste, pretty solid at 244,000. Wastewater's coming in at 977. Harbor has a loss of 424,000, but keep in mind that the Harbor in particular has a lot of capital contributions that have been made, grants that you've received. So not all of the depreciation of the Harbor necessarily needs to be recovered. So I'll show you that in a moment. And then, you know, overall your total enterprise funds because of the electric fund is running at a loss. The other number I really want to kind of share with you is when we look at our cash flow from operations, total cash from operations is positive for everybody but the Harbor, but then the Harbor receives that raw fish tax. So really, when you look at this overall, those enterprise funds are generating cash. And the difficulty here is when you get to being able to pay for the debt. So for example, the electric fund generated $8.1 million of cash. But when you look at the interest and the principal payments on their bonds and notes, that total there is about $8.5 million out the door for principal and interest payments. And so, you know, the fees and charges have to be able to cover the debt load. Really close in the electric utility now. It's very close to the total amount of the principal and interest payments for the year. That's really the only one that kind of runs pretty close to it. The Harbor is definitely running at a cash deficit, $8 million deficit last year, but you have quite a lot of capital asset funding for the Harbor. So a lot of your purchase of the capital assets this year was covered by grants. I think that was actually a contribution of an asset itself. So total cash there in the enterprise funds of about almost $40 million. So the notes start on page 35, and I won't cover all the notes. I'm going to give a couple key highlights for you in our last few minutes. The cash footnote goes on for quite some time, and that's the first one I'll mention. And that starts here on page 43. This gives you an outline of how the funds at the city and borough are invested, whether they're in cash or money market funds or other types of securities. But it also will tell you a little bit more about your policies for what you can invest in. And then how it's reported in the financial statements themselves. There's also more detail on your receivables and your capital assets. And then I will just quickly run through to the, and also on long-term debt, if you ever wanted to see what the outstanding debt agreements were for the city and borough. You can look at that. You do have general obligation bonds outstanding, as well as DEC loans, which are at 1.5%, pretty good debt debt rates, although with markets this year, they've been just pretty low overall. And then you do have revenue bonds for the harbor and the electric fund and the airport. The only other note I want to pull up is your fund balance note, because I think it's important for you to really pay attention to fund balance. So your fund balance overall, it actually goes on for 2 pages. But if you look, for example, at the general fund, you do have a working capital reserve set aside and an emergency reserve included in your committed fund balance. So it's not sitting in that 3.8 million of unassigned, but it is there to make sure that you have enough working capital to be able to, pay your bills and those kinds of things. The hope is you never have to tap into that working capital reserve or into the emergency reserve, but they are there and included and committed. And they're in committed because you as an assembly took action to set that money aside for that specific purpose. There are also money set aside for the Southeast Economic Development Fund, as well as the capital projects that you already have in process. The only other notes I want to cover with you in our limited time has to do with your sale of the hospital, which this is your pension note. Nobody wants to read that. The sale of the hospital is outlined for you on page 75. And actually, even above it, talks about the debt refunding that was done in July of 2020. So that's another subsequent event. But the sale of the hospital that happened in April of 2019 is disclosed here, along with the terms of the receivable. And then when you look at page 76, you can see all the detail of what was sold and what was retained as part of the hospital sale. And then lastly, I will just highlight for you page 78 in the coronavirus footnote, just talking about the impact of the pandemic on the city and borough, and then it does disclose the total amount of CARES Act money, 14 million, which was spent subsequent to year end in 2021. So that's the main items on the Kafir that I would like to cover. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I realize I covered a lot of information, but if you have questions on any specific items that we talked about, I'm going to pause and then I'll spend one final minute looking at the single audit report.
Questions from the assembly at this point? Okay, I think we can move on. Thank you.
Okay. The last page I want to cover is on the single audit report, which is the 3rd package you should have received. And I'm on the 2nd to last page where we summarize the results of the audit and the single audit. And as you can see here, there are a bunch of no's. We did not identify any findings, no non-compliance reported. This year, we did audit your PILT program. Next year, you will need to have the CARES Act audited. Everybody's expecting that. And then when we look at here, you do qualify as a low-risk auditee. So no findings this year. When you look at your total state assistance, you have a total of $8 million of state assistance. Some of that was for the harbor and the transient float replacement program, about $4 million on that. You also get PERS relief. They pay into the PERS program for you. And then about $900,000 of debt reimbursement this year. There's also a few other grants that you have from DCCED, as well as your community assistance program, which is the old community revenue sharing. On the federal side, you have a little bit more going on. You have your forestry receipts money. There's a few other Homeland Security grants that came in. You have your PILT money that we audited without exception. Have a few other violence against women discretionary grants. You've got some active grant writers who get good money for the state. And then your DEC loans are actually considered financial assistance from the federal government because they pay in a portion of that loan program. And then finally, your highway planning and construction cluster and your airport improvement program. So total federal awards this year of about $3 million that was spent in 2020. So with that, I'm just gonna finish up and just thank your team as usual. Very impressive. You know, we hit them with lots of requests. They did an excellent job. You know, I think the stage was set well for Melissa to take over as finance director, and she certainly stepped up to the plate very well with the audit process and getting the Kafir out the door. And just always a pleasure to work with the folks there. They do an excellent job. And happy to answer any other questions.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Joy. It is great to see that there were no substantial findings on this audit, as is normal. I think we do a really good job, and the comprehensive annual financial report definitely answers more questions than I could even think of asking. The amount of information in there is kind of mind blowing, and I know as an assembly member, if I have a question on financials, I know I can find it in this book. So I do appreciate you providing all of those materials, and I appreciate your year after year commitment to the audit of Sitka. Having an auditing team that has been here before and understands our system, and that can be called when we have questions about how to account for something, I think makes the entire process easier. So thank you to you and your team. Is there anything else from the assembly before we take a break before the meeting? All right, Joy, good to see you, and look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you much.
Thank you.
And then we'll be on recess until 6 o'clock.
Mr. Mayor, it's Rebecca. Do I leave this meeting and join the assembly meeting?
I don't know. Does she leave the meeting and then? Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay, I'll be with you in a minute. Thank you.